Okay, a very good morning to everyone in the audience and also our panelists today. I cannot express how excited I am, and I think we all are, to welcome the three scholars who made so much effort to join us here today in Chiang Mai University and to be in Thailand in this time of traveling that is very tough and requires a lot of processes. We are very excited also because the three scholars today are representing the International Public Policy Association, IPPA, who are here to be with us, to co-collaborate with us, potentially in the future, for us to host the International Conference for Public Policy, or ICPP, or any other conferences that the association would like to plan. We are a school of public policy that is situated in Thailand, and we're the only one. We have the programs in master's degree and PhD. And today we are joined by most of our MA students and PhD students who are in town in Thailand or in Chiang Mai. The rest of our students are actually overseas, unable yet to travel to Thailand. And we're also joined by our researchers, our research partners, our pre-doctoral fellow, and also our faculty affiliates from political science, from economics as well. So today we have an exciting plenary ahead because we will be hearing from the three scholars, and the focus will be on reframing policy formulation. We're very honored that the three professors are spending some time to share their thoughts with us. So each one will speak about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for the plenary and any Q&A. Also acknowledging those on Zoom. There are about, not counting ourselves, there are 16 people right now joining us in Zoom, coming from Singapore, also here in Chiang Mai, who cannot be here. Timothy from the United States is also here with us. So there's a variety of people, and also I have to acknowledge Professor Ora-orn, who's the chair of our governing board. She's also here with us in the Zoom. So without further ado, perhaps I can have Philippe to be the first person to share his work on policy formulation and the political processes related to policy formulation. Philippe. Okay. So while Philippe is setting up, let me introduce their names, actually. Professor Philippe Zittoun and Professor M. Ramesh and Professor Leslie Paul. And also Professor Piyapong, of course. Piyapong, you're on the other end. Professor Piyapong will also present our work related here in Chiang Mai and on the policy formulation aspect as well. So I look forward to a very interesting and engaging discussion ahead. Here, Philippe.
Oh, thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here to discover Thailand, Chiang Mai, and your School of Public Policy. So it's a great opportunity for me. So let me introduce myself. So I'm Professor of Political Science in University of Lyon, and also the General Secretary of the International Public Policy Association. So my main work is about understanding the policymaking process and specifically its political dimension. And today, originally Frank will be here and we present the book. So I do to present very quickly alone. But it's a collective book that we publish this year. So the name is A Political Formulation of Policy Solution, Arguments, Arena and Coalition. And I just give you a brief introduction about the purpose of the book, and we can come back later if you are interested. So this is just a quick presentation of the chapter of the book. So the main idea of this book was born after a reflection about the consensus we have in a policy community, actually, coming from these works, important works in 1960s, 1970s, about the politics of problem definition. Probably you know this work. The main idea developed originally by Charles Schneider, Barack and Coburn Elder was to suggest the importance of the pre-decision process, where the access is highly restricted because there is an arena of the conflict about the problem, and where the problem can be suffocated, disappears, reinterpret, what call the authors the manipulation of bias to prevent its emergence. So this work plays an important role to understand what we call today the agenda process, the problem agenda process, and this idea that to emerge, a problem needs to follow a certain trajectory with a definition process. A problem not emerge by itself. It emerges because there is an activity of some of policymakers or problem makers to push, to define and to push the problem on specifically the mediatic agenda. So there is a large consensus about this in the policy community, in the scholars, to understand this. But what is interesting and what we discuss is probably a less consensus about the policy formulation process to understand it. There is different approach to grasp and to understand this, what we call the policy formulation, which take place also in the pre-decision process, but generally more in a hidden space. It's like the bureaucratic space, the expert space, the interest groups. So the formulation is generally considered as less conflictual, more apolitical, more incrementalist, but problem definition. So this stability, the idea of stability of policy formulation is also linked in a lot of work to the idea that policy community, there is a policy community which is dominant and we exerce a dominant position to define what is the good solution. So the main idea of the book is to reconsider this idea of the aconflictual and apolitical idea of policy formulation. And our main hypothesis was because if we consider that the policy formulation is aconflictual or less conflictual, is because we have not enough observed. What is more difficult to observe is the hidden space. Is the hidden space of specifically the bureaucratic space and what's happened inside. So we have sorry, I'm enough far away. So the main we have right about the idea, but there is something in my screen here. Okay, the main aim of this book is to stress the political dimension of policy solution formulation to show that this stage can be and often political and conflictual as the problem definition process. So we have worked on this in different chapters, and we have worked on the idea that policy solution, which is for some people expect as an objective and neutral instrument, we propose closer observation of the multiple arenas where the formulation of policy solution take place and where multiple actors in different configuration engage a definitional and political struggle. So more precisely, even if I don't enter in the detail, we are very focused on three kinds of what we call political filter. The first one is the argumentative and meaning filter. The second one is what we call the ownership filter, and the third one is what we call the struggle filter. And I try to explain each quickly. What is the argumentative filter? The main idea first is to consider, to observe policymakers in the policy formulation process in the same way that we observe problem definition. So it means that a policy formulation includes different steps of definitional process, like naming. At the right, I put you what we know about the problem: naming, identify public of victim, causes, responsible and culprit, and a dramatic future. This is what we call how the main people build what we can call a drama problem. If we observe the formulation and the policy solution, we can have this kind of things, which is naming, like the first one. So when you choose a solution, if you're naming this, I don't know, lockdown, it's a name. If you say, I don't know, VAT, so whatever the name of a solution, naming is always something important. Or as you can have for the problem, for the problem, we decide, for example, there is a fighting to know if the COVID name, the variant is a variant of the name of a country or a letter of alphabet, of the Greek alphabet. So now everyone knows the Greek alphabet with this conflict. Even if you see, we don't use all the letter of alphabet, of the Greek alphabet, which is one of the things where everything is political, even the COVID. We don't use the Xi. Normally Omicron is Xi, but Xi Jinping doesn't like it. So naming, it's an important dimension. Instrumenting, identifying who is the beneficiary, domesticate the wide problem. I will explain one or two things in all this process. I just explained designing an hopeless future and legitimating the decision makers. This is what we call the definitional process of the policy solution. What is mean, and I just focus on one or 2 points to explain what we mean by that. When you define a policy solution, whatever your role, you're a politician, you're an expert, you're a technician, you're a bureaucrat, the first thing is you define what is a society and who is a winner and who is a loser. There is no policy formulation without everything win. So even if you say, okay, I install the licensed driver, it means that in a society, you decide who has the right to drive and who has not the right to drive. If you say we lock down the country except the shop, which is essential, you define who is essential and who is not. I don't know here, but for example, in France, there is a big debate about who is essential. So policy formulation contains all the time a repartition about who wins and who loses in the society. There is no solution where everyone wins. The second thing is how solution, and this is one of the things we already discussed a lot, arrive to solve a problem. It's a big debate in the policy community, this link between problem and solution. First, because you have 2 traditions. You have the tradition coming from Kingdom and Cohen-Marshallson who say, oh, solution is independent from the problem. And you have the policy analysis tradition to say, oh, we can find a solution coming from the problem, from solving problem. But we also know that it's impossible to solve 2 complex problems. So the question is how, so it's Wildavsky who explained that the craft of policy analysis is to define a problem which can be solved. So the question is how to solve a problem. Sometimes we redefine what is the problem, more that we solve it. And I can give you an example with a system we call the causal substitution. One of the best strategies used by policy analysts, but also politician experts that we observe is what we call the causal substitution. So you have a problem you don't know how to solve. I don't know, homelessness or worker problem. And you say, okay, the problem is this, but there is a cause of a problem. And sometimes the definition of cause is nothing else but a way to redefine what is a problem. If you say, for example, that the difficulty to have a full employment in a society is linked to the rigidity of the law, so you have identified a cause, but you have also redefined what is a problem of the society, and rigidity of labor code, for example, is more easy to solve than the problem of full employment. And last point, so what is the strategy to solve an unsolved problem? This is one of the questions we have at board. And the last point, which is really political, is each policy formulation contains a definition of who governs and who decide. So I have no time to develop too much, but just focus on the 3 points. The ownership filter, what we call the concept of ownership, is was developed initially by an author whose name is Gus Field, an American sociologist, work about law about driver, and who speak that who defines the problem is also the owner of the problem. And because define a problem is also an unequal repartition of who have the power to define. So we use this concept that also Rochefort and Cobb have used to understand that there is not only the definition, there is also the art to pursue different actors, because we know that in any policy-making process, any decision-making process, any decision process, you have always a lot of actors which is involved. So a solution is not just like this. If you have the best idea of a good solution, it's not just become a coalition definition. It's something that you need to share in a persuasion activities. So the ownership of a solution, there is no solution which exists without who supports the solution and who define. We call this the ownership, and it's something important. But it means that in the same solution or in the same definition of problem, it's not the same situation. So if you have a housing policy, you have automatically the Ministry of Housing and some bureaucratic, which is owner of the solution. I work on a shale gas license, and I work specifically on how some bureaucratic space is owner of who have the right to give authorization to drill in France or to not drill. So owner of solution is also, you can't separate solution definition and who have the right to define. And the last point, it's to consider the concept of arena. Most of the policy scholars identify that the policy formulation is under one system. One policy system, one policy formulation system, dominated generally by a policy community. What we have observed is that there is a multiple arena, not only one. And it's not a linear system. So to understand the complexity of policy formulation, we need to understand the complexity of the system itself. So what is an arena of debate? It's an arena with a limited access of participation, a specific configuration of actors, and different mode of regulation and dominant argument. So sure, we have the public arena, which is the most famous, but we have a lot of multiple discrete arena. Some of them is linked to the division of task of the bureaucracy. So each time you have a system like a university, you have 10 departments, it's 10 bureaucracy. So, but it's also 10 ownership. Could be ownership of rooms, or it could be ownership of a solution. So there is a lot of ownership possibility. Some arena is totally under control, and some arena is really a place of struggle. And this is why we try to symbolize something like this. So it's to change our perspective about policy formulation. The number of actors involved in the policy formulation is largely more complex than what we have imagined first. And the trajectory of the policy formulation is under a lot of policy. Some arena is really dominate. We call this atrium. It's really a closed space where there is one dominant actor. I don't know, if you have a law, you have all the time, for example, some people who have expert in law and who manage the domination. If you have a budget, you have the Ministry of the Budget, which is central. But you can have different other situations which arrive. Just to give you an example and to not be too long, I just published a book, for instance, is in France, but in French, but the new version in English arrived in few months. It's about the shale gas policy. So French have decided to forbid shale gas in France. What I tried to understand is the government changed 4 times its position by choosing 4 different solutions in 2 months. So it means that in the same condition, a government can change a lot of time. But where is this solution come from? And what I observe is they come from different arenas. It's not coming from the same arena, and they have a different trajectory. The first solution coming clearly from the bureaucratic space with the specialist who want. But the other solution change from different arena with different powerful situation. And to understand who govern and who have the power, it's interesting to see this complexity of policy formulation. And to finish and to conclude, so in the book you can find, we try to really understand how coalition is being problems and policy proposal, how there is a building of coalition, we call this ownership, and how competition and constraints of each arena plays a certain role in policy formulation. So in this book, we try to open new way to understand better the policy formulation by what we have, for instance. So it's a more conflictual view about political formulation, because if there is a more consensus about problem definition, there is not consensus about policy formulation. But this is when it becomes interesting, is to really understand what we need to discover in this. And one of the questions could be also, is there a different kind of political formulation depending on the kind of political regime? This is one of the topics we can also discuss for the future with empirical case. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philippe, for sharing your most recent book, the idea of multiple arenas within the policy formulation process, getting us to see more of the complexities and fluidity of the debates that go on, and not think that it's a linear, straightforward process. So thank you so much for setting up the stage for us. If I could invite this sequence after Philippe, which would be Leslie, and then Ramesh, would you like to comment after, or would you like to wait after Piyapong presents his work in Thailand as well? Okay, so let me pass the microphone to now Professor Leslie.
I'm triple vaxxed and I've been multiple tested, so I'm going to take my mask off for the presentation. Let me first begin by thanking Dr. Ora and her colleagues and team here. We've had a wonderful experience, and it's really been amazing to meet her colleagues, the university administration, and students here in this panel. As Dr. Ora said, I'm Leslie Powell. I'm currently the founding dean of a College of Public Policy at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Doha, Qatar. We have an MPP, and we should have a PhD, I think, in a couple of years. So if anybody wants to do another master's degree, you're certainly welcome. And if you're looking for a PhD in a couple of years, we'd be happy to look at you as well. So I'm going to be talking about a book that was just released this year, an edited collection entitled The Future of the Policy Sciences, edited by myself and my colleague Anise Brick at my college. The background to this is the okay, hold on. This is the cover of the book with the usual blurbs on the back saying how wonderful it is, and then this this gives you, sorry, oh, down here, okay, I can do that. That one, there. This is the table of contents. Let me give you a little background on the book. It actually arose, and this is a nice connection to Dr. Ora and Dr. Philippe's notion that things don't work in a linear fashion. For you guys, being at your stage of the academic career, you take a look at an edited book and you think, oh, there must have been some brilliant plan behind it, in order to bring all of these people together. In our case, it started with a conference in Hong Kong in, I think, October, November of 2019. And Ramesh and Philippe were there at that conference, at that workshop. And the workshop was on the future of the policy sciences. And it was an interesting experience because we were gathered together, and it was going to be the first of a series of seminars and workshops. And the next one was going to take place in March of 2020. And you all remember what started to happen around March of 2020. It was supposed to take place in Doha. So we met in Hong Kong in October, November. And we had this first of what we thought would be a series of seminars discussing the future of the policy sciences. And the reason that we got together to talk about the future of the policy sciences was that there was some concern about what that future would actually entail. There was a sense of ennui, a sense of stasis, of a kind of spinning of wheels, that the discipline wasn't refreshing itself. There may be some dead ends theoretically, and you heard from Philippe about a way of bursting through and rethinking some of the ways that we think about policy formulation. So the mood was a little depressing. And then to add to that, there was the whiff of tear gas outside our hotel, because at that time there were some protests in Hong Kong going on. So inside we were academics talking about the future of the policy sciences and confronting, speaking truth to power. And then we'd go out for a walk and you'd smell tear gas in the air, as the repressive apparatus of the Hong Kong government was cracking down on various pro-democracy protests. So there was an interesting connection between reality happening outside the ivory tower and what was going on in our discussion. So then we were supposed to meet in March, and people prepared papers and they were all ready to come. We bought tickets, the whole deal. And then as we got closer and closer and closer to the date of the workshop in March in Doha, we realized we had to pull the plug. But we had papers that had been, presented or prepared for presentation. So we then thought, well, what are we going to do with this treasure trove of material? Let's put a book together. So the book is less highly conceptualized in the way that Philippe's edited book is, because they started out with a theme and brought authors together. And so in our case, it was working backwards a little bit, but again, starting with this notion that we need to rethink policy. What is the future of the policy sciences? And so we arrive at this book with a combination of chapters about policy theory, policy formulation, policy teaching and pedagogy, and shimmering and hovering over all of these chapters is the beginning of the pandemic. So in a sense, you have to kind of wind back a little bit, and people were thinking about the policy sciences in the context of what was rapidly appearing by February, March of 2020 as something completely unprecedented on our lifetimes. Now we're all used to it. But back then, as most of you probably would have experienced it well, there was a shock of the new. How do we actually deal with this and how do we think about it? So the book started with this kind of general sense of misgivings about the discipline and a kind of low-level anxiety. How do we fix things? And then got jolted and pumped up considerably by, within the next year, thinking about the future of the policy sciences in the context of COVID. So what I'm going to do is kind of highlight three sets of themes that come out of these 10 chapters, and then they connect in very interesting ways and to some of the points that Philippe made. So the first set of themes had to do with the pandemic shock intensifying ongoing tensions, and we still see these happening here. The tension between globalization and nation states. I mean, there was a discourse even a couple of years ago that nation states were withering away in the face of the dominance and influence of international organizations, and that nation states were going to become appendages, and globalization was going to overwhelm national borders, national capacity, national agendas, national policymaking. And what we saw, of course, was that the first line of defense against the pandemic was the nation state, were national governments having to organize vaccines and lockdowns and reactions and blundering through trying to figure out what was happening with the pandemic. The tension between borders and movements of people and movements of goods. Again, there was an ongoing debate a couple of years ago that seemed to argue that borders should be, if not erased, then considerably diminished, and free movement of goods, free movement of people, migration, ideas, information, all of that should happen. Obviously, you know, the assertiveness or the assertion of borders and controls has come up. Securitization versus freedom and civil society. Again, that was a debate that was ongoing, but was heightened and emphasized during the pandemic. And then the tension between public health and ongoing pandemic concerns with other issues and ones that, you know, want to dominate public discourse and public debate, like climate change. And I'll come back to that. And then the role of the state, which is embedded in some of the earlier points that I was making. And what we began to see then, and we continue to see, is an extraordinary assertion of national powers, nation state powers. And, you know, this is all obvious. Lockdowns, things that would have been inconceivable, the lockdowns of entire national populations. We now take for granted, and we read in the newspaper that, you know, government X is about to reimpose, because of the 5th or 6th or 10th wave, you know, a lockdown in the entire city of X, or, you know, is going to reimpose a national, we kind of just, we read the headline and we kind of assume that's normal. Sure, of course. 2 years ago, that would have been absolutely incredible that, you know, a government would force all of its citizens to stay indoors. So, you know, contact tracing, and then, you know, the combination with social protection and a kind of ideology of safetyism, and minimal risk or zero COVID. And we see that in the Chinese case and to some extent in Australia and New Zealand. So it leads to an extraordinary assertion of national powers. And then that's combined with the kind of ideologies of rebuild better, which has been the pandemic response, plus the importance of climate change, plus certain social justice concerns that have come up in various jurisdictions, most notably in the United States. I'll come back to this in a moment. And yet, combined with this remarkable growth and assertion of state powers, we've also seen remarkable examples of total incapacity and incompetence, even in countries that we would have expected to be in the top of the league tables in terms of their ability to deal with a pandemic. Germany, France, forgive me, Canada. I'm a Canadian, so I can, you know, there were lots of cases where, at least in the early days of the pandemic, people were saying, well, of course, you know, the OECD countries are going to be responding really well, but those poor guys in South Korea and Thailand, and, you know, they're going to be just things are going to be terrible there. And, you know, in many respects, it was the opposite. So what was going on there? A second set of themes with respect to policy fields, and this, you know, these were discussed in the various chapters in the book. What happens in the pandemic context, and what should be happening or might be happening in terms of the future of the policy sciences. You know, the impact of the pandemic on education. You've all experienced it. I don't have to belabor it in terms of online teaching and remote access. Also impacts in terms of the work week and work venue. So the economic impact there. The importance and configuration of healthcare services and how they're delivered. And to me, frankly, and this ties, I think, quite nicely to Philippe's comments about the framing and shaping of arguments. What I call Uber policy frameworks, where states are now and governments are now arguing and being pressed to combine very dramatic and drastic post-pandemic rebuilding strategies to get their economies back on the feet, plus a very radical and extensive climate change agenda, plus an agenda around health safety, which includes everything from contact tracing to you know, constant tests and vaccine mandates, and addressing issues of inequality, social justice, et cetera. That's a pretty powerful stew, a pretty powerful combination or architecture of arguments that leads directly to a much expanded role of policy making and policy and states in terms of policy. And this connects to policy processes and how are policy processes going to have to change in the future, assuming that, you know, the pandemic effects last for some period of time. Much better or much greater focus on risk assessment. Exactly, and you see the debates about this. I mean, people that are arguing against lockdowns have a different risk calculus than people who argue that it's much better. For example, in the case of Omicron, you're already seeing these arguments. We can't wait for the research. We can't wait for the evidence. We can't wait for anything. We must now impose the same dramatic responses that we had before in order to be sure. So the emphasis on prudence and minimal risk. So it's really a debate about risk tolerances rather than the specific empirics of the pandemic. How you process evidence in policy making now when you've got multiple streams of very different kinds of evidence, public health, and then again, this goes back to the argumentative framing. You know, public health officials quite understandably focus on public health considerations and minimal risk. Lock everybody down and shut down every business and every restaurant because that'll obviously minimize risk. You get the economists in the room, and they're going to do a cost benefit calculus. You know, how many lives will be lost, and you know, what is the cost per life, and you know, they end up with a arithmetic calculus that suggests that for economic reasons we should keep everything open. So when you put a public health person in the same room with an economist, you're going to have a different framing of the same set of empirical evidence. So how do you, as a policymaker, actually reconcile that? I think we need to, or will have to, rethink policy instruments and instrument design quite considerably. Again, you know, the very obvious examples of lockdowns and contact tracing and everything that we've seen in the public health field, and then data tools and data platforms. And my colleagues in the harder sciences and in AI and in, you know, digital processing and all the things that are available here in this room, you know, there are wondrous things on the horizon. And as students of public policy, and to some extent as practitioners, we're going to have to become masters of different types of data tools and platforms. And that leads to a third set of themes that are at a higher level about how we think of our policy theories. The policy cycle is probably the most standard. You know, you go into any library of public policy, in any school of public policy, anywhere on the planet, you're going to find Ramesh's book, number one, and then you're going to find something about the policy cycle and the standard, you know, policy formulation and all the rest of it. We may need to go from policy cycles to policy cyclones, and think about the way in which everything gets upset and upturned, and you know, this kind of linear lockstep, you know, virtuous circle of problem definition to implementation to evaluation, that just ain't going to work. So, and global policy making. How do we think about global policy institutions and global policy? Nation states, I think, had their moment, and they're obviously still very much at the forefront of responses to the pandemic. But international organizations like the WHO, you know, have reasserted their prominence and their importance. The UN, around issues like migration, around issues like climate change, international organizations want to keep their leadership role. So the exact balance between this re-energized national policymaking capacity and necessity, the balance between reassertive and more important state policymaking, domestic policymaking systems, and international organizations and global policymaking is going to be interesting to see. And then some behavioral insights. I mean, you all know about nudging and, you know, trying to understand exactly what the effect or impact of different policy instruments are going to be, given what kind of behavioral responses we might be able to expect. But as Dr. Ora and I were mentioning the other day, you know, we may need to rethink that playbook as well. I mean, people that have been locked down for 6 months, when you let them out, are going to behave a lot differently than people that, you know, had a normal life for the last 6 months. And so the behavioral insights may need to be modified to some extent in terms of the lived experiences that people have now in a very different kind of world than was ever anticipated when people were doing their little experiments on behavioral, you know, behavioral activities in the lab. And I'll close with how we might need to rethink for the future of the policy sciences, how we teach and what will be in the content of our programs and our courses. How do you manage perpetual crisis? This gets back to the notion of policy cyclones. I mean, what kind of pedagogy would provide the skills for people to be crisis managers more than policy managers? Then that leads to the notion of developing capacity for agility. Imagine a pedagogy or a policy program that was completely founded on the linear policy cycle and the kinds of management skills that you would expect of people coming out of that kind of program. You know, they would be linear, fairly plodding thinkers about policy. If they took courses and pedagogy aligned more with Philippe's, they'd be thinking about argumentation, about conflict, about political formulation. If they're taking programs that are really alive to the cyclonic nature of contemporary policymaking, you're going to produce people that are more like ninjas. You know, they're going to be policy assassins. They're not going to be policy makers. They're going to have to drop from the ceiling and do weird stuff in order to be able to, you know, deal with the weird stuff that's coming at them. And that, you know, leads to more boring stuff like multidisciplinarity and battling bureaucracy. So, you know, we may need in the future of the policy sciences to produce different policy scientists. Thank you.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Les, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. And it's very kind that they put a 17-year-old picture of mine. I feel like Queen Elizabeth, who refused to have a portrait done after the age of 30. So that is the last photograph that exists. Yeah, no, Philippe made a point that I personally wouldn't have disagreed with 30 years ago, and I think very few people would disagree that politics is very essential in how we define a problem, how we look for solutions. And like you pointed out, that we should be. What I want to talk a little bit about is the role of imagination and sentiments and how they are insufficiently emphasized in public policy. At the end of the day, public policy making, actually not the end of the day, beginning of the day, and the end of the day, public policy is about the future, which we fundamentally do not know about. We can guess it. And guess it's like buying a property. Looking at the last 30-year property prices really doesn't tell you whether it's a good price or not. It just tells you stock market, the same thing, right? You can Dow Jones data, you can get it from, I believe, 1898 or something. Minute by minute, there are billions of data points. You can analyze and dissect them. It still won't tell you whether to buy that stock or not. In fact, that much data will certainly confuse you. What you need is some imagination to make sense of that data. And this is what we need in public policy. And the discipline, the way it engages in the debate is fundamentally incapable of dealing with it. I find that quite dysfunctional to posit politics versus rationality. I think nobody in the world seriously believes that they are choice. You have to be rational and you have to be political. Political is rational. Even in the economic sense, something. What they both lack is a commitment to imagining a future and creating a space where imaginations could take place, debated, discussed. We do not create that space. There's no reward for such a work. I'll give you a very mundane example. When you walk into the building and the thermometer that you see, what is it for? You thought about it? Nobody knows. It's certainly not for identifying COVID-19. Vast majority of the people who have been infected do not have temperature. Do not have temperature. If you have the temperature and you took a Panadol, you can come in. It won't catch it. They have done surveys in US. Randomly picking out people in the crowd will get you better results than using a thermometer to. But why do we do it? We are creatures of the past. That's what we did in SARS. That's why we have installed them all. And these are universities, right? We have all the data. We know all the information. I'm sure there is nobody in the public health faculty. But who will take the decision to remove it? When it was installed, we didn't have the imagination to how to measure it. Of course, we didn't know about it. So we did the best thing we could, go back. But then we are now victims of our own lack of imagination. They're stuck. Because like, who will decide to remove it? What if something goes wrong? Would you take the responsibility for it? So just let it on, you know. And here they actually have, I don't see any in Singapore. There's somebody standing behind it and will stop. Why don't you take the temperature? It's like a really serious business. Anyway, and this just is a very, it's not an important example. It just shows how public policy and decision processes and you know, in public policy, it's quite fashionable to kind of dismiss what goes on in business. But business is one field where I'm willing to learn imagination of the role. When Tim Cook or whoever imagines a future of this product, or Henry Ford says that, you know, why don't you, who did you consult for inventing the Model T? His answer was that certainly not the consumer, because if we had asked them, they would say, give me a faster carriage, horse carriage. So he imagined that what will people need in the future once you have a car that moves faster, cheaper, then you create jobs. More importantly, you have to raise their income so that a common person can buy those cars. So it unleashes so many other things that even Henry Ford didn't imagine. But at least those kinds of thinkings have been promoted, and in public policy, we don't do enough of it. And yet we do know of the successes of, say, Korea. Somebody, a civil servant, imagined the world's biggest steel industry in a country that has no experience in making steel or had no iron ore. And within 10 years, they became the world's largest and most efficient producer. And somebody imagined it. Singapore Airlines is another example. In a landlocked country where there is no monopoly, every flight is competitive. Imagine that, look, you know, that is the reason to have an airline. All the other airlines are government owned. Well, Singapore Airlines is also government owned, but they say that, but if they'll run better than anybody else, then we'll make money. And they haven't been the most profitable in the last few years, but for majority of the last 40 years, they have been the most profitable airline in the world. It's because somebody back then imagined it. Singapore is the world's largest refiner of oil, you know, for the population. It doesn't have any oil. It brings it from Indonesia, refines it and sells it back to Indonesia. All what I'm saying is, even say, you know, these are business examples. Take the example of CFC. You guys are all too young. I don't know about including my colleagues here. I was in college. I remember CFCs being such a major problem. Ozone layer was, remember that? The ozone layers was depleting. Why? Because people were spraying their hair. And that Montreal Protocol, blocking it, they didn't have a solution, but they did imagine a process of reducing it. So imagination can be of a product or service or a process. You set up a process by which incentivizes producers to get rid of what they don't want. So those styrofoam cups became paper cups, I think, in a few years. The hairsprays became just pressurized air within a year or so. Air conditioners took 10 years or so. So we don't celebrate these people who came up with the idea. The original idea, it comes from the economists, of course, but to implement it and don't make it necessarily tradable in the sense we understand it. I don't know what I'm saying, but I'm just, other than highlighting that we have to go beyond this dichotomy between rationality and power, because power and both of them are linked to the past. Power because understanding the existing structures, but that's because of course, they are reality. Those patterns of relationships are reality. You can't, no imagination can get rid of them just because you imagine them out of it. But imagine a future, a different configuration. Is there something they could agree on that they normally do not agree on? because when we do the stakeholder analysis, we go and ask them. We don't actually ask them. You usually know what they will tell you, right? Even before you ask them, you try to imagine what would they agree on, and give such people, an opportunity. How will we do that? I don't know, but we certainly have to in the School of Public Policy, in government circles, do more than we do. And maybe the business faculties, I'm just another imagining. I don't know nothing about what they teach in business faculties, but I have seen departments of business innovation, entrepreneurship. We do have Gilberto, our colleague, a very good friend, writes on policy entrepreneurship. Maybe that's the one way to do it. How to promote them, reward them. In Singapore government, there are incentive schemes available. People who can say that came up with an idea that was workable, and they get pretty handsome bonus. So maybe this is another way. But maybe there's yet more ways that we haven't thought about, because we are still talking about politics versus rationality when the debate needs to go. That those are, yes, we agree. Let's move on now. Less said, it's more about the future. Let's stop there. Cambridge University Press, health policy in Asia. It doesn't imagine any future, it just highlights all the problems. That sanctimonious lecture.
Thank you so much, Ramesh. Okay, I've been triple jabbed as well with negative 80K, so I'll follow Leslie and Ramesh to take off my mask temporarily. We at the School of Public Policy, including the Thai government, we're pushing very much for the future studies, doing all kinds of foresight, and not just your typical sort of trend analysis, but more of the imagination, more of deliberation, and really looking at the possibilities. So I just want to acknowledge that our partner is also here in Zoom. NESDC is also with us, the National Economic and Social Development Agency of Thailand. And you would not realize, but today's panel might actually leave a big footprint in Thailand policy making process. We have TP Lab, the Thailand Policy Lab folks with us as well in Zoom, coming in from Bangkok. We also have our own PhD students who are in Bangkok working on the future space. She's presenting, actually today there's a conference on future studies in Thailand. She's presenting her theoretical paper there. And our other colleagues coming in, Poncho coming in from Australia, Sajad from Pakistan, and also our Chris Hartley, known colleague from Hong Kong, is also in the Zoom. So there's a lot of people who are interested in what you're saying, Ramesh, for sure, in the future space, and how do we articulate that and have structures around studies of that would affect public policy. And definitely the concept that Leslie put up, policy cyclones, I'm really going to remember that, especially policy assassins, the people who can move fast like ninjas, the Uber policy frameworks. All these are, I think, requires imagination of how we can reframe policy formulation. So next, I'll pass the microphone to Piyapong, who will share with you perhaps concrete projects that will ignite us for more imagination here in Chiang Mai. Done.
Thanks, Ora. Actually, what I plan to present today is the attempt to address what Ramesh mentioned, and actually somehow connect to the point that you addressed, Leslie, especially the limitation of policy cycle. And we also engage somehow to the political condition and try to work with it as Philippe shared with us. So is this the Okay. Yeah, I already turned on my camera, I think. Yeah. Okay. Perfect, right? Okay. So what I gonna do actually is not what I did, but actually what we have done so far as the team. I mean, most of the people here engaged in this project. And our school public policy, actually, we perceive ourselves as the academics. And we try to push forward the theoretical discussion in the field of public policy and also the practical work that we still need to change, as Ramesh mentioned. So what we always keep in mind is that we need to work with the limits, especially the political domination, the authoritarian culture is not only about the system or the regime, but actually it is the culture as well. We try to work in the face of the pandemic, the limit of the resource, financial resource, of course, and even the number of staff that we have. And we try to assimilate into the highly centralized system of the country, try to work with the static techno-bureaucratic system, as you can imagine about the context here. And we also try to articulate by connect the different actors in the particular policy network to work together. So what I gonna do today is simple. Is simply the attempt. I would say it doesn't mean that we want to claim that we achieve or we just fail in this and that. No, it's a kind of the lesson that we want to share, and what we aim to do so far, I think actually is the attempt to make difference. We try to go beyond elite framing policy formulation, which is going to be the mainstream or conventional or traditional approaches in our country, and we try to go beyond the linear thinking to link between the input process, output, outcome, impact, and we try to go towards more critical, empathetic, and of course, as Ramesh mentioned, try to be more future-oriented. As with our particular context, we really need this, and we try to use the friendly tools. For example, we use the post-it paper, the cards, the map, and simple visualization. Not only me who present here, but a lot of people here engaged in the project that I gonna share today, which is just only one of our practices so far. I would say it is the flagship of this year, and this project is called the Chiang Mai City Lab, which we work with the National Innovation Agency and the municipality, Chiang Mai city municipality. And what we try to do is exactly what Leslie addressed. We try to challenge the policy cycle. We try to we try to say no to thinking about agenda setting and start with agenda framing. And with that, it's changed the whole loop. It's not the cycle anymore, but we perceive it like the jigsaw instead, that you put the space for policy learning along the whole. It's not the movement like the cycle, but actually it's kind of you put things together. And we start with the first step that we think is very important is to unpack the common hope and fear. And I think somehow it relates to what Ramesh mentioned. It's about the imagination as well. It's not only problem at hand, but we try to unpack hope and fear, because everyone in the society have hope and fear. They might not know the specific technical analysis of the problems to identify the problem from the technical analysis, but everyone have their fear and they have their hope. So this is the way that we try to empathetic and also try to include all people who have different rationality, as Ramesh mentioned. And then we try to find hope in the fear. and try to transform hopeful into wishful. And the last jigsaw that I think is very important is to push forward wishful towards willful. And I just want to share really brief what we have done so far. For the first step, I don't want to say stage. It's not really good as it's kind of the notion of policy cycle, but I would say the first jigsaw, we have on-site exhibition that people can come and address their hope and their fear. We have an online platform as well for them. And we also have something that I think very interesting here. Is the insight, which means that we open for the photographer to take part into this, to take a shot of hope and fear in different corners of the city. And we end up with the exhibition. Our friend over there, Best, who led this activity, it's very interesting that we have the art gallery that people can put sticker into it. They can draw anything that they want to draw into it. Yeah. The first thing that I mentioned is the exhibition that people come and point out what is hope, what is fear that they concern. We engage young people, old people, and even children in this platform. In the photo, we call photo talks, because we let the space for general people who come to see this photo to interpret, to give the meaning into it. So people can also put the sticker into and also draw something, as I already mentioned. So it's very interesting to see the city and not just thinking about problem identification, the basic idea that bureaucrats usually do. We try to shift it into thinking about policy in the sense that people can address the hope and the fear, and that's going to be the good start for thinking about how we're going to go further. And of course, it's about talking with people. It's about site visit to talk to different groups, different representatives. We create the atmosphere that normal people can come and share and end up with the idea. Before we allow bodily standard, then we connect from the very good idea how we're gonna COVID fear and build up hope, come and share their idea to the leader, the mayor as well, of the municipality. So it's transformed from the informal to formal arena of political decision making, as Philip mentioned. And it's very interesting in the sense that when startup, when the active citizen present the idea and the policymaker in the old paradigm sit there and listen to them and buy and bought the idea and and try to support them to put forward. So we move from the find hope in fear to transform hopeful into wishful. We organize the deliberative forum to thinking about the specific plan, what we're gonna do, for whom, when, and how. Very specific here. And you're gonna see that young people and old people work together, male, female, and I think it's very interesting to see the role of the open platform, that policy formulation not necessarily be addressed by the policy maker who have powerful by the kind of formal authority that they have, but actually lay people can be policy maker as well. We call them policy designer. Everyone can be policy designer. They need to work with the policy maker, the formal power, and this is going to be the very good case that we end up with a kind of the mock-up, the prototype of the solution, which very interesting because it addresses the real fear of the city and also try to build up hope of the city as well. I cannot go into the detail, but now we already put forward wishful toward willful. We have the project that we try to support the senior citizen, the vulnerable group, and people with disability to access to the healthcare service directly, not in the normal system, but have a different system by use the bottom, SOS bottom, and then the medical service gonna come and help them at home. We use the application and the bottom to try to connect between the senior citizen, the disability people, and the caregiver. Yeah. We also have a very good idea about infected waste, how to deal with it, and collect information, and also thinking about make sure that people gonna trust that they walk around in the city and they're gonna save from infected waste. That a lot of city concern about this. We cope with the risky areas by use the SOS as well for the people who walk in the risky area. They can use that, and people gonna come, and even the silent gonna raise the voice. And also we have the intervention for the vulnerable group, for the homeless people. We share the medicine, the basic pills and the alcohol gels, the masks for the poor. By using a kind of the basic vending machine that people can come and access to it. We also create the public space that people can use during the pandemic. They can find the open space to walk, to run, and don't worry about sleeping, because we use special asphalt that can absorb the water to the ground to take care of the soil and also the green space nearby. We also have a very interesting intervention, which is to allow to open the space for the people who have a problem about depression, to express their emotion. We call the emotional expression space, which is in the new name is the aggressive movement. You don't want to worry to be aggressive. You can use this space to express your depression. And this is the way that we don't look at the problem, just a kind of physical problem, but thinking about the problem that is about the fear of the people, it's about the mental impact, and then they can find a space to express that. And of course, some innovation, some policy intervention is about the way that we're gonna improve the service, public service of the municipality. Yeah. So all of this, we try to shift our role from the technical expert to work as the deliberative facilitator, and to try to be the interpretive mediator when conflicts arise, and try to be the critical flames. I mean, our team try to be skeptical, try to thoughtful all the time, and reflective all the time. And we try to do our job to empower people, to enlighten, to emancipate as much as we can do, and try to, use the fresh eye that look at both the role of the agency and the importance of the structures, and of course the relationship between agency and structure as well. And as I mentioned from the beginning, we always provide space for learning, which mean we go beyond just success and failure dichotomy. This is all that I want to share. And actually, we have a lot of projects by our team who's sitting here, that I think if you want to learn more from us, today I just have a short time to present only one project. You can go into this reference if you want to explore other projects that we have done so far for making difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Piyapong, for your presentation. I just want to emphasize for the audience the word pracademic. So the project that Piyapong presented on City Lab really displays our intention of bridging practice and theory, and also showcasing having our own on-the-ground experience working with the city of Chiang Mai. And our experiences with the city of Chiang Mai leads us to better collaborate and engage at the national level. So we're doing both national level and city level. And as you can see, we translate everything into our academic work, into publications for the international level. So the Chiang Mai City Lab, for instance, we have a PhD student, John, who is part of the project as an observer and translating the project into his PhD thesis on deliberative approaches. So just to emphasize that we always try to integrate everything into the DNA of our work with our partners, with the location that we're in, and also in the academic expression that we make through our publications. So now that it's been quite a one-way communication and we've heard lots of interesting ideas from our panelists, let me now open the floor to people here in the audience. It's exactly 39 of us because I counted the chairs. And then we have 31 on Zoom. So if anyone would like to ask questions, make comments, add to anything in the discussion, please raise your hand and I'll monitor both online and on-site, please. Oh, we have about until 11:40 to finish off. And after that, those who are here on site will have a special session with the scholars to give out your name cards and have more personal conversations to share who you are and what you're doing. Okay, so anyone? Do I see hands? No, okay, this is a new skill that the moderator needs to have. Huh? Okay, Ajahn Phopsuk.
But I personally have a question to Professor Ramesh. As you mentioned about as a school of public policy, we perhaps need to promote more of the policy entrepreneur or policy entrepreneurship to create those kind of policy innovations, right? So to my experiences is that sometimes I push them, I mean our PhD, MA student to have this kind of capacity, skills, and attributes to be the policy entrepreneur. But when they go out to the existing system, so they feel like, okay, it's not what I learned. So it feels like they have to work hard to be a policy entrepreneur in the existing system. So I would like to ask you to share, if you could, about the what do you think about the policy ecosystem? I mean, structural dimensions, cultural dimensions, legal, institutional framework, those kind of things that can help them as an individual or group of individual to be a policy entrepreneur. What kind of ecosystem that gonna help them?
I'm speechless for answers. It's one of those things that we all know, but it's certainly public policy is not the only space where it's difficult. In business world too, this is the biggest challenge, right? MBA programs produce managers; they don't produce entrepreneurs. How do you entrepreneurship in business? And they can tell you about how the life histories of the past entrepreneurs. It doesn't tell you anything how to train the future. But we do know that some things work. One of the things that work is passion. But how do you make people passionate? We don't know. Some governments, especially I think, I haven't seen it in words, the Singapore government thinks that financial incentives work. Maybe because they can't think of anything else. And I can't think of anything else. It's probably an important reason. In business world, we certainly know why people are entrepreneurial, because they expect to make money. Maybe in the policy world, the same thing. I'll tell you an anecdote, which I just occurred to me 2 minutes ago. I was thinking about it. As a child, there was a guy who we all thought was kind of odd. Whenever you meet him and talk, he will talk about public toilets and how it affects. We were kids, we didn't understand what this guy's talking about. Why is he obsessed with toilets? Because I'm from a middle-class family. I never had the problem. And then 20, 30 years later, I find out that a few billion people on Earth, this is one of the biggest problems they start their day with. And especially this in India, close to 700 million people who still don't have a proper. No, this is such a, but he never gave up. Poor guy, he died before the government took it. So it's, but he never gave up on the idea. Maybe it's that kind of a passion, people who see a policy problem, they may not have all the solution, but they have different ideas. And whenever they get a chance, I published an article on policy design for toilets. I thought I should pay homage to this great man who I didn't know him was so great. And maybe this kind of recognition there, it's very universal benefits, income support schemes. People have talked about, but there are some people who have been relentlessly talking about it for the 20 years. Even though no country actually had it in that particular form. What we should not do is silence a debate too early. What I find quite frustrating, in any meeting, there is somebody who's distinguished, wears a tie, senior, and say, oh yeah, we have tried it before, it didn't work. Come on, maybe it didn't work before. Hear the person out, because otherwise we'll just be keeping thermometers at the entrances and thinking we are solving a problem. We're not solving any problem. We're just pretending to do something about the very urgent, Yeah, I don't know whether that answered your question. But create open spaces.
Cool. Open space, yes. And the atmosphere, perhaps, right? At least in the meeting rooms. Can I invite Nok? I think you put up a question. This is our PhD student in the Zoom. Would you like to turn on your camera and ask your question, please?
Thank you, Zanora. Hi, everyone. And my question is about the temperature check upon entering a building. And I wonder why that kind of...
Are you speaking?
Oh, yes. Can you hear me?
Okay, we can hear you.
Okay, so my question is on the policy process that has to happen, like in order to enable the replacement of temperature machine to random sampling, because theoretically, random sampling might be more efficient and more cost effective in terms of finding the COVID patient in the building, but it's not been implemented. And what has to happen in the policy process in order to some good ideas to take place in a timely manner, and for like the sake of environment too, because temperature machine is made of plastic and it's plastic everywhere now.
Okay, thank you. So the question is on the random sampling. What are other ways to not do random sampling, or any more innovative ways to find cases? I guess that was the question.
Or
As an example, the idea. Yeah.
I guess
population.
Ajahn Ka.
Would you like?
Well, let me say, actually,
You first.
No, what I was going to say is that it seems to me that the smaller the political constituency or policy constituency or theater or arena within which you're operating, the more you can directly access or contact actual policy or populations. You don't have to sample randomly. So the case that my colleague presented shows a way of at the community level and municipal level, the opportunities there for connecting directly with participants is much greater than it would be at a say a national level. So that's why I was going to turn the mic over to you.
Well, if we seriously about the concept of inclusiveness as the entry point to thinking about sampling, I think is the problem is not about the number of the people that we're gonna engage, right? But actually, it's just about the representative of different voice in the society. If you put people more than 100 people in the room, but actually they come from the same background or think the same way, it doesn't matter at all. But when you include people, just only 10, but they represent different voice, different background, different career, and even different stigma of their life, it's gonna be what we're gonna call the meaningful participation or deliberation, I think, yeah.
So I see a couple of hands, Poom and then Waratida. I also want to hear Ajahn Phai's point about sampling too, as an economist. Okay, so Poom first. So we'll take maybe two questions at a time.
Okay, so thank you for accepting my question. So I have a question regarding the power and rationality dichotomy. So for public policy maker or practitioner, whose agenda should they follow, the government or the interests of the public? Because, in some time, especially this time, the government has a very strong incentive to impose lockdowns, assert their power into the system. So whose voice should the public policy practitioner listen to? Thank you.
Thank you, Kapum. Waratida, he's our faculty. We'll do two questions so that one of you could choose to answer and then another one of you could choose to answer.
Thank you so much, all presenters, and good morning, everyone. My question could maybe more toward Ajahn Piyapong's presentation. Sorry, but it's very great project that you and your team have done on the City Lab. What I like to ask is like, in terms of public policy, some aspect of public policy we have to work on multi kind of discipline, including work with the people from science to, for example, climate change policy. We can't just rely on social science, but we need the climate scientists to to show us the scientific data. And when we rely on that data to create policy, and your project, you present another way to create public policy using the empathy, using the emotion, hope, and fear. So my question would be like, It is very good method, of course, innovative method to create public policy. But what I like to see more is how public policy scholars can work well or work better with the people from science department, from engineering people, from architecture people. So I want to see more on that, and I would like to see your comments on that too. How can we work together with the other people from other discipline? Thank you.
Thank you. So whose voice do we listen to? How do we work better with others? Okay, Philippe.
Okay. So I'm not sure to really understand. So if I'm wrong, you will tell me. But I think the way you ask the question is problematic. And I tried to explain. First, you suppose that there is one government. But what I try to tell you is, even in the policy formulation, there is how many people compose a government and how many different positions, and how inside the government, and I include arena, I include expert, bureaucrat, there is so many conflict inside, but there is no one government. And there is no, you can't speak about the government. The reality is more complex. And second, what is the interest of public? Who define what is interest of public, and who have the right to define it? And how the define of interest is also a way to impose something. And I come back to what he says, and who participate. More you involve people, more it's not so easy. Who have the right, who have the possibility to speak. It's not only who is in the room, and who have you need some capacity, which is also an unequal repartition socially. It's not something thing. So this is the first thing, and I think that we need to little shift the way we observe, and in this way you can arrive to recompose. There is if you have a view with two opposite things, you don't arrive to understand. But if you spare your view and see the complexity, you can see the capacity of action as the capacity of limit of action, because this diversity is also an opportunity as a problem. And for the second question, it's about policy diversity. But the question is what we speak about exactly, about policy scholars and about other policy. Do we speak about, I just think about an example. So there is a lot of policy. So I think policy scholar and expert is everywhere in the policy making process. And probably most of them have more powerful than policy scholar itself. This is what is actually with the COVID, who have the power? The epidemiologist. And it's a change in the way we govern. Who have the idea to lock down people? I'd say it's maybe the more powerful policy who can exist. And there is a lot of conflict between the policy, the expert. And I think that, for example, the debate about do we need to vaccine the children is interesting, because the opposite epidemiologist and pediatrician, you say, about what is expertise and what is what is interesting in the policy scholar can observe also this process. This is also his academic field, is not, because there is two things. There is policy entrepreneur when it's applied, and there is also policy scholar when what is his data is to observe the policy making itself. And I remember this French prime minister who said, my problem is the morning I see an expert who explain me that the wave arrived, and the afternoon I see another expert who says the wave not arrived. So the future, as evoked Ramesh, defines the future is a powerful capacity, but the question is also uncertainty. How we can know that we don't know. Everything is open, but
can I just say something about just shoot mouth off without knowing about who to consult? One of the standard answers has been consult the stakeholders, right? So we all consult, we teach them how to do stakeholder analysis. And then it occurred to me that what do you expect to hear from them? You can read newspaper, they have already expressed they won't come to a meeting to change their mind, right? They say things exactly that they have been, that's the business group. All the statements are there in the newspaper over the last 30 years, they haven't changed. So everybody's position in the stakeholder community is already known. What I'm getting at is that other strand of my work on policy capacity. The idea that somebody else can do your work is prevalent. Or government's incapable, privatize it. You don't know what you're doing, consult other people, hire consultants. What does a consultant say? What you want to hear, right? Because they want your next consultancy. Why will they tell you something that you may disagree with? Governments really have to take their own capacity seriously while they should consult. But that's not a substitute for their own ability to understand and analyze, imagine. They can't leave all the future imaginations to ideas that come from society. For societies, of course, there are many creative people who can come, but the government officials get paid to do their job. And that job should not be confined to doing routine paper pushing. There has to be. Some of the stories we know from software companies, particularly say Google, their CEO was actually an engineer. Engineers are not supposed to be entrepreneurs and in mind, but in his Google has a process. Probably still does, they definitely did. Where one day a week you can do whatever you want. So the Gmail and Chrome, which dominate the market, came out of his imagination. An engineer, not particularly distinguished within the company, creates a product. There was a system in place for rewarding him. And to put him right as the CEO of the world's largest company, why can't we do that in government? I know why we don't, but there has to be. Probably we can't turn them into billionaires as soon as Pichai became, but maybe there is a little bit more we can do than we do.
A couple of quick comments on your question. I think policy analysts or policy students of public policy are increasingly, excuse me, going to be performing a kind of, well, some of the points that were made on the last slide about what were they? Interpretive mediator, deliberative facilitator. This kind of intermediation and facilitation of different expert groups doesn't say the value added may seem relatively small, but increasingly, if you have different groups of experts and technical people living within their own particular technical silos, there's no one to actually think about the bigger picture. So, I mean, the example would be designing an academic building. You know, you bring the architects in and they're going to be doing SDG environmental stuff. You bring the IT people in, they're going to be doing all the IT stuff. You bring the professors in, they're going to be thinking about the faculty lounge and you know, exactly what the configuration of their offices are. The students are going to be thinking about where can I get some food and, you know, how can I get to the library kind of thing. So, you know, bringing the different groups together is a crucial function. And I think that's what we end up teaching a lot and increasingly we'll need to, that kind of interpretive facility, being able to at least feel comfortable with different disciplines and fields, doing risk analysis, understanding something about public health, and being helpful in terms of being able to facilitate that interaction. And the bigger question about the public interest is really, it's super interesting. And how do you frame that appropriately? And that would take us to realms of values at the highest societal level, and to try to think about, you know, if you, as a policy student, what are the ultimate values of your society? How do they cascade down to supplementary or subsidiary values? And then how do you situate yourself in terms of those when it comes to different kinds of policy problems? I mean, I'm living now as a guest working in an Islamic society, an Islamic monarchy that's rapidly modernizing. You know, and one of the challenges from a public interest point of view for Qatar is how do you maintain the traditions and the culture of Islam in a Muslim society, particularly when the native population is only 15% of the total population, only 400,000 Qataris in a population of 2.7 million. So 85% of the population is expat. They're people like me, or they're coming from all parts of the world. So at the highest level of public interest, what is the public interest? That might be one kind of trade-off that would have to be considered by the government, which is in this case, you know, the emir. And then how does that cascade down into what do you do about social media and the impact of social media on young Qataris or young people? I mean, that kind of debate is framed differently in different countries. But ultimately, I mean, this is where and why you take courses on ethics and public policy, and where you should be exposed to these larger societal issues. And how you position yourself with respect to that is partly an individual choice, but you need to be sensitive to how those values they're not, it's not that they're hidden, but they're embedded in what appear to be technical policy debates about regulation of social media. But if you think clearly about what's going on in those debates, you realize they're almost always about the ultimate values of society. And that's a pretty tall order to try to reconcile and deal with, but it's inevitable, it's important.
Okay. As Philippe mentioned, this is the epistemology question. The point is that we surely recognize the empirical evidence, especially from science, as the valid knowledge for sure. But what we plan to do is to also articulate the empirical evidence, the scientific knowledge, to the normative knowledge. And the last one that we introduced, actually, just want to promote the new paper in the critical policy study. What we call emotional knowledge is another epistemological policy debate that we introduced, and we want to, I would say, want the epistemic community discuss more about this. Yeah.
Charge you for your PR. Just joking. But just to add to Ajahn Wan, I think the idea of studying emotions for psychologists, it's the observable that they study scientifically. But for policy scientists, it just seems as something unmeasurable, unobservable. So we kind of have been dismissing it. So that's another way to look at that. Okay, so time's running out. I wish we had more time. I'm just going to limit to the last three questions. Professor Casey, Lee, and Syed, and Nathan. So please give your question short and sharp. Professor Lee is from our political science faculty.
Short and sharp. Thanks for the very insightful, refreshing presentation. I'm just to pick the key question would be referring to Ramesh's point about imagination and how sometimes we are so stuck in the past, going by the temperature monitoring system. So I'm just wondering, how are we going to develop a strategic policy amnesia, so to speak, a very selective and conscious effort to forget some of the irrelevant or obsolete policies in the past in order to promote and to release policy imagination. And I'm just wondering how institutes and think tanks like SPP could play a part, could play a role to create such conducive environment. I'm just wondering. And because in the context of different political contexts, such policy amnesia ecosystem might be a bit challenging. So I'm not sure whether you have any ideas on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Lee. And this would be related to the situation in Myanmar as well. Our neighboring friend, and we have some researchers from Myanmar sitting here with us. Okay, Saeed, can you turn on your camera, please? It's your turn to ask your question. And then followed by Nathan. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Ajahn Ora, and everyone is in the room, including our Professor Piyapong and Chirada, and our guests, and everyone who have participated in this well meeting organized. Thank you for our, what can I call, guests, their presentation, including a policy formulation and future of the policy science. The question that I wanted to know is really when we are talking a policy formulation and policy system, most of the policymakers talk about the future event. and what they always think about how will be the future of the next generation, and so on and so on. Most of their time is spent to talk about the future. So why they don't make any policy that are fit to solve the problem that is going at the moment? Because we know there is a money problem that is going at this time, but why they don't make a policy that fit for the event that is going in now? Then they are talking about the future expectation of future policy analyze and so on. This is the question that I have. Thank you a lot.
Okay, thank you very much, Said. Next, Nathan.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the very stimulating discussion. I have actually two questions. Basically, one, I was a practitioner of public policy and involved in various aspects of decision making and all that. And one of the issues that I faced on a daily basis is the timing of the policy, actually, because some of the policies rationally they look good, but then the timing of that policy may not be feasible at certain point of time. So the issue of timing is something that I kind of wonder. I mean, probably there is some policies, like, for example, if you look at sustainability issue in Southeast Asia, if you ask 10, 15 years ago, I mean, most of the government leaders will tell you that I'm focused on the economic growth aspect of it. So sustainability can wait. So that's one aspect of timing. The second is, I think, in terms of the policy process, I find the whole process is disjointed in the sense that at every part of the process, decision making, policy formulation, coordination, implementation, different actors are involved. And one of the problems that I kind of find is, how do you keep the policy process moving smoothly, because there are different actors involved and it's somewhat disjointed unless you have a very good administration across the various policy process. So these are two questions I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nathan. So he's doing a PhD with us, former Deputy Secretary General of ASEAN. So coming with a lot of practical questions that links to practice as well. Kap, you have your hand up. Would you still like to ask a very short question? Yes.
I would like I would like to ask Professor Leslie. I come from business sector, and I would like to know about the future of policy science to apply as in private sector or business sector. Business sector.
Okay, so those questions combined, if you can pick and choose or combine your responses about 1 to 2 minutes each, I think that would be great. But I think ending, towards the end like this is kind of nice because it opens a lot of room for more to discuss. Anyone? Oh, Philippe is pointing fingers. Okay, Leslie first.
Let me respond to the first question and then the last one, because that was directed to me specifically. On the policy amnesia question, it's really a nice phrase. But I don't know if people need to be amnesiac. If you imagine a policy lab or some kind of policy space where people are constantly asking why, just keep asking the question why. So temperature checks, why? What is the purpose? What is the objective? And this goes back actually to the earlier question about policy entrepreneurs. You can be incredibly entrepreneurial just by forcing people to ask themselves why. Because what happens in normal bureaucratic life is things just get going, and then they take on their own momentum and inertia, and people just keep buying into it, and they put up the temperature checkers, and because that's what everybody's done before, and they're just going to do it again. So the simple question of why and forcing people to think about their objectives can be tremendously helpful in policy development. So, maybe not for a forcible amnesia, but a consciousness, a heightened consciousness about why it is you're doing what you're doing, not by habit and rote, but deliberately. And if you think about it, you may realize that you need to do something different if you're going to do it deliberately. On the question of including businesses and the business sector, as one could look at this and as an academic critically, and the power that's exercised by the private sector and by large businesses. If you look at it from a practical point of view, how governments need to develop their sustainability agendas or economic development, working with the private sector is hugely important. So I think that's a given, and better connections and interactions with the private sector is really important, both for policy formulation going forward and for economic development. The one area where I think we're going to begin seeing some major changes in government private sector relationships are in areas like social media, privacy, and the use of data by firms in terms of developing their marketing and their consumer profiles. So I think that's going to increase the regulatory opportunities and pressures on governments to deal with the business sector and social media, but also the use of private actors of private information.
Yeah, in response to the first question, we don't want to underestimate the constraints that institutions, politics, there are very good psychological reasons, economic reasons, all kinds of reasons why change is difficult. We know all that. And sometimes the more you know, the more limited you feel and powerless you feel. So outsiders are better in that because they don't know all the constraints that exist, and they come up with the solutions with the burden of everything. Doesn't mean that you should be ignorant about things, but sometimes just letting in people who are outsiders. And here we can. I'm dabbling in organizational psychology, about which I know next to nothing. In organization, there are pressures on the individuals to conform, and especially in the hierarchical setups. That you can say something that will ruin your career, so best not to say anything, or optimal is that you enthusiastically support whatever that has been said. Flattening the organizations may be one of the part of the solutions, where people and there isn't necessarily a penalty. You've probably seen them in seminars in hierarchical setups. The discussion is really not very useful. The useful discussion takes place when the groups are smaller and everybody feels that they are at equal level and they can contribute. So maybe that, and we certainly confirmed by the innovative software companies, where the setup hierarchy is very, very short. They may secretly get a lot of salary differences, but you don't know about it. In a setup itself, it's flat. They're all at the same level, and they can really, discuss, criticize without penalty of saying something wrong. So these are small things. I haven't systematically putting them together. What we do need to do is just to think about it more seriously as to how to promote this activity.
So I would like to, so I select one of the questions. It's about the temporality. And I would like to come back to one of your questions in the beginning, because I think it's all linked. When you say, oh, we have so many people with scholar, and we arrive to the world of practitioners, and suddenly they change. And at the opposite, we have someone who comes from the world of practitioner and say, oh, there is so many things that you don't take into account. And I think the problem is here. If you want to even to have imagination or to have innovation, you need first to understand what is it exactly the policy process. And to understand policy process is not your imagination, it's your work of investigation. And this is something for me which is really important, specifically for people who make research, is to say our first data is how we really understand the policy, the complexity of the policy process. And what you say about temporality is important, because what is this kind of temporality? So first you say, so there is the temporality because there is so many part of the process which depend of the same configuration of actor. This is the first thing. Sure, people within implementation is not the same but in policy making process. And we know that each time you have a configuration of actor, you have another uncertainty and autonomy of the process. If you don't understand this, you don't understand why there is so many difference between the different steps. The second thing is, what is public policy? Is how you govern behavior. And what is the other autonomy? Is the behavior of people who don't answer to what you think you want to manage. So if you say you want that people all have a mask or all have a temperature or all have, so, but people is always more smart than what you imagine when you make public policy. So never forget. So this is why also with the temporality, time after time, the policy outcome change all the time. And you don't manage this. And probably this is also why there is so many activities. So my first thing is really to say, okay, be careful about, so we need to be ambitious, certainly, but also modest. How many things we really know. And if you just imagine that you know the world with your computer, or just in a virtual world, you forget something. And I think that the role of policy scholar is first to better understand this complexity, because before understanding this complexity, you never arrive to act. You just say, oh, reality is just different from what I imagine. And I have so many ideas or innovation, and when I arrive, I don't arrive to do anything, because you just forget that this complexity must be to take into account, and also the powerful dimension that I spoke about in the beginning.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Piyapong, would you like to say?
Just want to emphasize that we need to recognize from the beginning that we are working with the limits, and this is very important, especially in the context like this. I mean, not only us here, I think a lot of people out there also face with a lot of challenge. Some people might say that what we have done is not really destroy the structural barrier. We still live in the world that have a lot to do. But for us, as inspired mostly by the critical pragmatism, I think the most thing that we need to recognize is to thinking about 1 to 100, 0 to 100. We walk in the long way, and just recognize the small win along the way that we walk to. If we don't do that, I think we're gonna work very hopeless condition, because we cannot change that, we cannot transform this, and then we cannot achieve what we should done. The point is that just try to do the right thing that you need to do, and then work with the limit and try to move from 0 to maybe even until the end of our life. It's not 100, but maybe just only 40. I think it's better than 0, right? So just try to emphasize this. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Piyapong. Okay, everyone, it's been a very stimulating and exciting event. I want to go back to Leslie's point about, let's ask why. Why are we here together today? For me, definitely the excitement comes from, oh my gosh, I'm actually meeting 30 people in the same room with academics who've flown in from overseas to have this possibility of moving. I'm not going to say post-COVID, I'm going to say just living with what we have and doing our best, having the hybrid. So why did we do all of this? Is because to bring back that exchange, that platform between practitioners, academics, students, researchers, scholars of different, mid-careers, seasoned scholars, young scholars. This is what we have surely missed in the last 2 years. That's the first why. And the second why, of course, is what we all know. This that we have had today, we hope to have many of these sessions if we host the ICPP somewhere in the future. It won't be just this room, it'll be multiple rooms, over 30 rooms perhaps, of different people presenting, discussing, sharing ideas, and also all of the friends and academics online who can come in. It's much more inclusive now. We have so many people in different countries who have access now to the debates and the discussions today. So this is the other big why that we have today. On behalf of the School of Public Policy, and actually on behalf of Chiang Mai University and Chiang Mai City, I would like to really thank all the committee members, Philippe, Ramesh, Leslie, and also Professor Frank, who I know is here with us, following us and also supporting us as well. I would like to thank all of you very much for everything that you have done and all the knowledge that you have shared. And also, of course, Piyapong and Boossabong, who's been the team to put all of this together too. And everyone else in this room as well. Jamikon is our training manager who's in the bid proposal. You have not spoken to him, but he's behind the scenes since last year to look at the venue and everything. And of course, everybody else, I'm gonna name everyone, but you know who you are. So please join me in a round of applause for yourselves and of course for our guests today. Okay, Ka. So everyone in Zoom, thank you so much for joining. I know you can hear me. We'll still leave the Zoom on so you don't feel you're cut off from the event abruptly. But those who are in this room and who would like to talk and engage more with our 3-4 panelists, of course, you can come up. And then at about 12:20 or so, we'll move out to lunch. And 6 of you will join the panelists for lunch. So you could perhaps save your time then and let others who are not joining lunch to get to have the stage. ขอบคุณมากค่ะ. Thank you very much, everyone.